So I'm pleased to report that we're right on time, and we have our full half hour for questions and for discussion. I'm going to pose a couple of questions, and then we're going to swing this around. If you have questions, we're going to invite you to come up so that we capture your question on the recording as well as a response, and I'll ask all of you to share the microphone as well. There were a lot of wonderful themes. First of all, let me say thank you for sharing all of this wonderful wisdom with us today. There were a couple of themes that came out for me, so since I'm up here, I get to dictate where those themes go. And the first is this question of to plan or not to plan. And it also raises this question, this deeper question, what is a plan in this day and age? When we're dealing with such an incredibly complex site, where's the park? There is no park, or there are lots of parks. It's all park, It's layered, it's multivariate, and we heard all of that. So to plan or not to plan. I'm an academic, part-time, so I get to read Aristotle every now and then. And Aristotle was really concerned with practical wisdom and would argue that we shouldn't be trying to figure out a rule for every occasion, or an algorithm, we would call it today, for every occasion, but that we have to sort of foster wisdom so that whatever comes at us in a complex situation, we can figure out not the one right answer, but one answer that might work, and then we try it out, and then we see what happens, and then if that didn't work, we'll try something else. So there's a lovely book called Practical Wisdom, which is sort of pop Aristotle, if you guys want to check it out. But I think that actually gets at the heart of what we're trying to figure out today, which is we realize now there's no one right answer, there's no one right plan, but that there might be many multiple ways, a kit of parts perhaps, to get at what we're trying to figure out. And what I really liked, Andrea, about your slides was there was a lot of goal setting in there. What are we trying to do here together? And in a sense, if we could really articulate that, as complex as it might be and as many different answers as there may be to that, it helps to draw us along towards some solutions as opposed to trying to nail it down in one specific way. So that's not quite a question as much as just sort of an overall challenge to plan or not to plan. How do we start to grapple with that? How have you grappled with that in your own experiences? And where do you see that going in particular for the Gowanus? Everyone.
I'm going to jump in. Okay. I think that, what I loved about Andrea, your slides, is that it's obvious that there's a lot of really interesting initiatives around a kind of urban acupuncture approach of piloting projects. And I think that, and you're already dealing with lots of and those piloted projects are creating systems already. You have the wildflower corridor, you have the biosphere corridor. I think what I have found in some of the work that we've been doing is that, and you have goals, but the question is, how do you know that all these projects are sort of leading towards, are meeting a sort of set of principles or goals that you have? So what's nice about, I sort of would step back and say that there's different kinds of master planning. There's master planning that's incredibly prescriptive and says you're going to put a part that looks just like this here, and you're going to do this here, and you're going to do that there. But it seems to me if your interest is about sustainability, you could create a kind of... It's okay. It seems like a kind of framework that does look at like a kind of a hybrid of sort of design guidelines. The problem with design guidelines, those end up being quite prescriptive also. They're prescriptive in a text form, right? So, and then you have the other side of the spectrum, which is the drawing that's very prescriptive. And so perhaps there's something in between that isn't quite necessarily a design guidelines, but isn't really a master plan, but does look at kind of a framework. I know all those words sort of what do they mean, but I think you'll have to, you'll figure that out, I guess. I don't know, that's a very vague answer.
I just want to add some of our experiences on the Bronx River with plans, and I'm a planner, so I'm generally a fan of plans, but I'm not a fan of plans that just sit there on a shelf, right? Nobody is. And, I mentioned Bronx River Restoration did a master plan, but it did kind of sit there on the shelf. I mean, it did put out some bold ideas. When Bronx River Alliance kind of picked up the mantle of restoration later, we developed an ecological restoration and management plan and a greenway plan. And the most useful part of our greenway plan, I have to say, probably was the chapter that was the design guidelines. And that's the part that we use most frequently, that we make sure we get in the hands of designers and we say, look at our signage, guidelines, and look at what we say for, whatever, bike racks or whatever. And the rest of the Greenway plan, maybe not so much. I mean, it did force us to sit down and think about where is the route of the Greenway going to go and, to sort of put that down on paper. But the eco plan and the subsequent, we did an intermunicipal plan with Westchester County to sort of say, okay, this river actually, it's one river. We can't just talk about the Bronx portion of the river. That did, I think the technical expertise that we were able to bring to the plan helped us identify some initial sites where we could go in and do, more green infrastructure, because it's hard, right? When you don't have some input around the technical side of what's possible, then it's difficult to put in a grant proposal, or it's difficult to kind of go to your elected official. And so getting some of that expertise into like a plan, I think can be helpful and can just help you then, think out your work plan and projects you want to pitch. Anybody else?
The plan part of what we've done has actually been, we've gone to Sunset Park, we've gone to Red Hook and showed it to community members. It's a vision that helps create that coalition, which might more so than a set of guidelines, which are really important for designers or the people implementing. So there's different tools for different audiences, and I think coalition being another theme. Sometimes you have to think about, okay, what's going to be best to bring what kind of tools do we need to bring in the industrial work, landowner, the residential landowner. What kind of tools do they most resonate with?
Yeah, and just to go back to, I hope I didn't come across as saying that I don't think there should be sort of a master framework. I definitely think there should be. We've come to talk of it more as a scaffold, actually, as sort of a set of goals and principles by which we can engage people to make better decisions that we all can buy into. And I think it's all of these things that we're talking about, and I think it's really unclear what exactly we need to come out of this, but we know that the entire community needs to be on board. And I think that that's another part of the dialogue that's really difficult right now, is all of these words make a lot of sense to everyone in this room. Like kiddo parts, we all get that, but how does a community get that? And how do we make a community process where they can feel empowered to develop that?
Thank you. I think I'm downstream of all of the things that you're saying, because I get to deal with the grim reality of the plan and sometimes the guidelines, the city planning's waterfront zoning resolution that governs the way you develop and you design on waterfronts, I think is somewhere around 20 pages long. And so at different times, it can be draining, it can be enormously time-consuming to have guidelines that are so incredibly prescriptive that you find you're spending an enormous amount of your time trying to outsmart those guidelines. So hopefully, you'll come up with something but I understand the need for those guidelines, because if there weren't any guidelines, then we'd get the lowest possible denominator executed. So there really needs to be something. Again, how you go about doing that, I'm not sure I know that we did something many, many years ago called the Bronx Center Plan that were neither guidelines nor zoning, but a series of strategies that helped to develop a way of thinking about this place in the Bronx that almost 25 years later has evolved into something that has been built and is vibrant and seems to make sense. The background, of course, is always the zoning resolution that sort of sets the tone. So I guess whatever it is you do, hopefully, will improve upon that and work with it, because I think it'll have to.
Well, I just want to add to that, Lee, that I think that you exemplify the wisdom that we're talking about here, right? That your projects have been so responsive to context, and whether or not you're having to design within that particular set of parameters, that you're bringing that artistry to the process as well. I'm a native of the Ironbound in Newark, and so I just want to say thank you for a lovely park where there wasn't one before. But on this theme, are there any questions from the audience? Why don't you come up so that we can get your question on tape?
I think I ought to leave now.
Don't go. I have a question for you. Do you know if the buildings on Bond Street, the toll project, have their own retention tanks for their black water? Sort of private tanks, holding tanks?
Boy, I stayed away from most of the discussions about the buildings. We were involved in the design of some of the public spaces in the building and the shared residential spaces. My recollection, it's the best I can do, is that there is treatment within the building. I can't say. I know that there's some treatment. I can't say how much or what, but
Hi, everybody. I'm relatively new in town. I live at Bergen and Bond, so pretty close to the canal, and I love walking around there. If you could just give me a sense of, does the waterfront zoning text govern canals, or is there some kind, I know there's not a master plan, but is there some kind of zoning for new development? The 40-foot thing I've heard mentioned, but if you could kind of cover that for me, that would be great.
Okay, well, I'm not a zoning expert either, I'm a landscape architect, but yes, basically the zoning for new construction along the canal requires a 40-foot setback, which is what Lee has been dealing with in his work with the Lightstone project.
what was the follow-up?
Is there anything more complicated than that? I think that's about it.
Maybe is that it's for new, right? It's not, you're grandfathered in, right? I mean, you're
It's for
grandfathered
zoning
in.
changes. I think actually when there's a change in zoning is when it gets triggered, is that correct? Yeah.
It's when the use is commercial or residential. So manufacturing uses don't do that, but any commercial or residential use would be required to provide the space.
Okay. Did everybody hear that? Whenever any commercial or residential use, any new construction would be required to put in the 40-foot setback. And I think if industrial zone gets rezoned to commercial or residential, then obviously it gets triggered.
So I think one of the reasons why this is really important to this conversation is that there's this sort of, the housing pressure, the development pressure that's happening along the canal means that there may be a lot more residential and commercial development along the canal, which is going to basically make a public esplanade. But it's going to be in pieces, which again goes back to this master plan thing. It's not going to happen as one big esplanade. It's going to happen as many small esplanades that are not necessarily contiguous.
Any other questions on this theme? Just come on up.
This is a rather specific question for Lee. I think you were describing, from what I saw, mostly the Toll Brothers site work, but you're also working on Josh Reckness's site too, the BRT. And how are those going to play together, both in terms of the buildings and the landscapes?
Well, the Recknitz site is, as I described, is truly special, unique to the sites along the Gowanus. It was formed as a result of demolition spoils, and slowly but surely those spoils were colonized. And Susanna and I are somehow trying desperately to save that. And the design languages that we've been using in certain respects are the same as some of the languages that we're using on the Lightstone site. And again, I think that what we've tried to do, and a lot of those languages have come from our relationship with the Parks Department, because ultimately the Parks Department has interestingly enough, has the final say-so, or one of the this is like the 100 best 10 best days of the year. It's like the 10 best or 10 design partners that we have to work with, and the Parks Department is one of those design partners, along with the City Planning Commission, and the list goes on and on and on. But to answer very quickly, we've tried to use some of the languages that we've used in Lightstone for Recknitz, and we think that's important. Interestingly enough, again, many years ago, I was working on Queens West and Gantry Plaza, and we made a very conscious decision when we were developing a lighting plan, the design for the lighting along the edge of the project to use the New York City lights. We wanted very much to convey to the public that this was a park that was part, although it wasn't, that was part of the New York City park system. So there are elements of our design vocabulary that very clearly are part of the consciousness to the rest of New York of what a park is. And again, you and I think we know this growing up in the city, that you identify a park by these touchstones. And so those were very important to integrate into the park. Sorry for the long answer.
We'll take one more question on this theme and then we'll move on.
Hi, thank you. This is particularly towards the Conservancy folks, but in general, I'd love to hear more about this. I really like the phrase, a set of community guidelines, setting up best practices and principles about the spatial ethics of a neighborhood, and in particular around the Gowanus. And I'd love to know how this could be both collected in terms of like getting the community's guidelines together in a useful and also informative and informed way, and then also how to implement that, or how to get that, how to legally make that a thing. And if it's not legal, how to get, you know, all of these disparate private groups to agree to a set of guidelines. What is it, how do we actually connect those two ideas together and make it happen? Because I think that community sourced, you know, input is the best kind of input, but then there's the whole we need information, which is what you guys do. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's the big question. Good one. I mean, I think that to dive a little bit deeper into exactly what one of these guidelines or principles would be, I think it's not so much we need a bench, this is the exact bench we do, this is where you get it. It's more, this community really values having docking sites. Lee, you're building a landscape. We're going to give you that community value. You make an artistic decision about how to do that. So, I mean, I think it's a series of community meetings, a series of sort of community endeavors out in the landscape where we start talking about what do we value, what do we want to be doing, and what do we want to be experiencing in this landscape, and then involving designers in developing ideas about how that takes physical form, involving developers and realizing that they want to be liked in this community and they want their residents to be engaged with their landscape.
And I would say, to me, that's, as a designer, that's much more valuable than a set of design metrics that we have to meet, or in some cases, we've always tried to exceed those.
I just want to quickly follow up on that. Of course, time is money, right? But ideally, there's always the opportunity to have a little bit of iteration. So the designers hear from the community what their values are. They craft something in response to that. But there also, ideally, would be an opportunity for the community to say, well, wait a minute, that wasn't what we meant at all. But that starts into construction budgets and design budgets, and I wonder how we might start to navigate that. And that dovetails into the second theme we heard, which was who gets to come out and play, and in what way.
I think that's a good question. I mean, it's really, there's maybe not a perfect answer to it. We handle this in some ways by the fact that we have different teams at the Bronx River Alliance. So we have a Greenway team that are mostly made up of, community residents, but leaders from our partner organizations who are particularly interested in the development of the Greenway. And we, as our staff, we closely, work with the designers at the Parks Department or the consultants they bring on to develop the parks. And when we can, we, sort of strong arm those designers to come to a team meeting and do an extra presentation, or when they can't, we simply bring it to the team. And that's a way, that we work to get some additional feedback and input as we go.
Any other questions on this theme of participation and who gets to come and play in the design sandbox?
I actually consult with a lot of developers and a lot of people who are building in these neighborhoods in Gowanus, Red Hook, and Park Slope. And as somebody who is in a position to facilitate, developers come to us and they say, we want to build, what should we do? And as somebody who's in a position to kind of facilitate, getting these principles, into the design phase, how do we connect, the community with the developer, and what would sort of be your best case scenario for that?
Okay. I don't think I have a best case scenario. I think the point that I thought I tried to make in my presentation was that the majority of the folks on the development side are really afraid of communities. They're afraid of broadening the circle, and so their goal generally is to keep the process as focused and as narrow as possible. Not necessarily because time is money, but because there is the element of control and certainty that all members of an investment community want to have during a project's process. It's very different on the public side when you're working for the Parks Department, who is completely invested in, or most of the time, completely invested in cities and communities. So it's very, very rare that you can achieve that kind of community nirvana that in some cases early on in my career when I worked for the city, long time ago, that we were able to achieve because it was a fundamental part of our thought process. And it's important that, and I don't know how you do it, but I know you can. It's important that through the Conservancy, if the Conservancy is the leading edge, to broaden the scope and the dimension of the participants as much as possible, to make that a much more diverse and reflective of the entire community, as opposed to a series of limited interests within a community. And that's difficult to do. But it's worth it. To me, again, I think there is sustainability as we've measured it more recently, and then there is that fundamental component of sustainability where we get people to participate and take ownership in our projects.
So I've been sitting here thinking, I think that where the biggest tension, and again, those of you who live in Gowanus and are more familiar with the Gowanus area should tell me if I'm wrong, is that it seems to me that there's development pressure to build condos in an area that's been historically a working waterfront. But the upside is they're going to bring a public esplanade at some point. So you get the park, you get the public esplanade. But then there's the group, I'm sure many of you in here, who say, we want this to still be a working waterfront. So we want these industries to stay. Maybe not in their current, if they're polluting, form, but we still want them here. So I don't think that one thing I'm thinking is that you may have to have working groups that actually understand better the needs of industries that have been here a long time and what their needs are, and actually different types of if the other part is that those existing businesses may not have an interest in putting an esplanade right out in front. So you're going to miss the opportunity for that continuity, but yet maybe the community wants it. So it seems to me that there's a working group that's needed to think about how do we work with the existing industries that have been here a long time, who want to stay, who also are feeling threatened, though, I'm sure, by the economic pressures that are coming. And so those groups of people might be interested in understanding things like air right transfers and things like that. How can some of these industrial landowners sell their air rights to a residential developer next door that then perhaps gives them the opportunity to stay there by giving that. In other words, there's all, in the people who are looking at affordable housing, they're looking at all kinds of interesting ways in which to bring affordable housing to areas that have all kinds of other economic pressures. So I'm just wondering, when you're thinking about whether it's framework or master plan or design guidelines, it's going to be a different set, I think, of needs and interests and outcomes for those people that you want to have in the industry group stay versus the other issues that are there, the sustainability issues, what's coming with the new development. And I think if you don't have both of those, you're going to find in 15, 20 years, you're just not going to have those companies will be pushed out. They'll be gone. That's what's happened in every other neighborhood. So I think that's an important thing I want to add, I think, to the conversation.
Hi, I have two specific questions, one for Maggie and one for Tricia. Maggie, can you talk a little bit about, I think the ABC carpet project on the Bronx River is an interesting example of a private site that has provided some really great amenities, and maybe that's a good example to sort of describe and how that may relate to the Gowanus context. And then for Tricia, would you mind talking a little bit about, in your presentation you talked about high water levels, high water tables, and what that means for green infrastructure, the limits in areas where there are high water tables, and what opportunities exist in areas where there are high water tables, both in terms of green infrastructure and resiliency work. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. ABC Carpet, so this is the warehouse kind of outlet center for ABC Carpet. So if you're in the Bronx, it's worth checking out because it's an interesting place. But it also has a large parking lot and a large roof. So it's exactly the kind of private property owner that we would love to see get engaged with green infrastructure. And they did two projects, and I know more about one than honestly I know about the other. So I'll just mention they have a green roof project that they put in. I know they did that together with Sustainable South Bronx, but I don't recall the funding that came to that project. The other project they did was they took water from their parking lot and piped it into a constructed wetland. They used money from settlement dollars, actually. This was money that was settlements with I think 14 towns and villages in Westchester County that had illegal hookups into the Bronx River. And so New York State Attorney General's office, they reached a deal, and those settlement dollars went to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, who created a fund for Bronx River watershed improvements, basically green infrastructure improvements in the watershed. And that has been a big success. It was money that different groups applied to, and private property owners could apply themselves, or nonprofit organizations. We did a few of them. This was a project that actually Rocking the Boat, which is a youth development organization, applied for, partnered with a landscape artist named Lillian Ball, and developed this really gorgeous pocket park off the Bruckner Expressway that also is this new wetland system. So it's right across from Concrete Plant Park. People should come up and check out Concrete Plant Park. And while you're there, look across the water at ABC Carpet. And many times you can go up on the Bruckner and go down into it. It's often open for public access. But I think it's an interesting case of where legal action and the kind of creative use of settlement dollars to help fund this kind of work.
Yeah, I would say, probably half of the Brooklyn Greenway has got high water table along it. And I'm going to say the same approach might be good in the Bronx, where you have, bedrock. So in other words, wherever you can't infiltrate, what are your options? So I think that I often think about the fact that while a sponge is a great metaphor, sponges do fill up, and then they're no longer porous anymore, and then the water fills up. So, and then we have an overflow situation when that sponge has become saturated. And my guess is that a certain percentage of the bioswales actually that are in areas that don't even have high water table, perhaps one day don't actually, function the way they do now because there's more rain than we do now, we have more rain in the future, or because those systems get clogged by things, so the pores aren't there. And so I actually think that we need to begin thinking about these strategies as not so much, it is about infiltration, of course, and trying to replicate a kind of natural environment, but we need those mechanisms to keep that, if that water can't infiltrate, we don't want to put it in the drain, we need to keep it moving, and ideally moving through some sort of filtered system, which is why so much of our our framework is about getting the water to the nearest receiving body. It's about getting it, not necessarily, we want it to infiltrate where it can, but where it can't, we want it at least to get to the water source and not in the drain, which is why we need to continue to work with agencies across the board, DOT, DEP, about how we can continue to create channelized systems across streets to get the water across the street, or how we can continue to get water from the overflow from, one system to another, so that when it can infiltrate, either because the soil has been clogged over years of salt being put into the soil, or the sponge is full, or because we have high water table. There's no reason we can't just keep the water out of the system by just keeping it moving through various conveyance systems. This is not easy, but it's doable, and so I think that's one strategy.
So we have about 4 minutes left. I have another question, but I'm happy to step back to just open up the floor to any questions on any topic that you might have. So we've got even more time. Excellent. Questions from anyone on any topic?
Hello. Okay. So I was kind of formulating this question, and it's more focused on the nonprofit side, and just for me to get an update for case studies that might be out there, looking at the two nonprofits that we're focusing on, and Superfund sites. So I'm curious if there's been any change in how nonprofits in the city are working with the EPA and the funding from the EPA for Superfund cleanup, and partnering with that funding through the work of nonprofits, or if there's still kind of the EPA does their thing and we do our thing, and maybe there's some talking across the table, but it's kind of two different entities.
Well, the Bronx River is not a Superfund site, so we don't have any experience with that, so I'll pass it.
So I guess in our case, I think we are doing some interventions in the water. We do floating gardens, we do a salt marsh. In general, we're a little wary of getting too involved in what is a ridiculously expensive and complex project. I think our role is in ways more as advocates for what we want the edge condition to be like and what we can do after the EPA has done their dredging cap, as opposed to actually being part of that construction project, which is going to be so ridiculously complicated. Does that make sense?
Hi, my name is Natalie Loney. I'm the Community Involvement Coordinator for the Gowanus Superfund site. I'm with EPA. And so I can somewhat address your question. You're welcome. Anyway, EPA has been involved at the Gowanus Canal since about 2009. Actually, we were probably behind the scenes before that, but it was listed as a Superfund site in 2010, and under Superfund law, there's certain things that we can do, obviously, and certain things that we can't. In terms of community support and involvement and funding, there is a community advisory group, the Gowanus CAG. There are about 55 members. It's probably one of the largest community advisory groups in the country. They meet monthly. I've been to practically every meeting. Of the 55 members, they represent many different entities, including the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, many local organizations, as well as concerned citizenry. In terms of funding for the community, it's relatively limited. We do have something called a technical assistance grant, where EPA provides about $50,000 to a group within the community. They can hire a technical advisor, and that advisor acts as the kind of like the interpreter, so to speak, for the community on the technical components of the remedy. You see that the cost of the cleanup is about $500 million, about $506 million. That is exclusively for cleaning up the canal. EPA doesn't get any of that money. That money is how much the cleanup will cost. And the entities, the PRPs, who are responsible for the contamination, those are the entities that will be footing the cost for the cleanup. And so I know when you see $500 million, you're like, wow, there's money for the community. Unfortunately, it's really exclusively limited to remediating the canal from bank to bank. We actually are not even going to be remediating the upland portions of the canal. That's outside of the scope of Superfund. However, we are very much interested in development along the canal and its potential impact for the remedy. Does that answer everything? Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you.
The floor is still open for any other questions.
Hi, I'm Richard Hawks, new immigrant to Brooklyn. A question for Lee or any of you, but I've gone down to Red Hook and other places, and I'm aware of where the flooding actually occurred through various sources. But what's interesting to me is when I go down there, and maybe I've missed it, but it's been absolutely obliterating any memory of where the water was. And I'm wondering, how can the landscape be used as a way to keep people more aware of what happened in Sandy or other conditions, or what might happen in the future? And I liked your design, Lee, that you were doing, but is there a way we can incorporate in that so when people are using the landscape, it reminds them of the conditions that have happened or might happen in the future?
Richard, I hope that wasn't a trick question. I'm reminded of an artist who did what I think was called the Blue-Green Project, which was a line around Lower Manhattan that traced what was once the shoreline and what was once fill. So I would imagine that there is a way to physically scribe a line that tells people where the waters are. And I have an image of a town in Rhode Island where I also live called Wickford, where marked on the buildings there are the memory of the 38 hurricane and the floods that resulted. And I wonder, in your old neck of the woods in Johnston, and if there was if the floods were ever memorialized by designers or artists in that way. But right now it's just anecdotal. You know, we know where the high water, where the water was in the Gowanus. We know where the water came up to on Bond Street. Should that and could that be marked so that people are constantly aware of what the issues are and what the dangers are? Yeah, I think so, and I think that's a legitimate component for. That's a strategy, not a plan.
Totally. Principle.
Right.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, I think that in addition to marking on our existing landscape, it's how do we continue constructing the landscape to actually deal with this potential flood situation? How do we have a different building typology and landscape topology that can help stop, slow, and should we have housing on a first floor? Probably not. Should we be able to actually accept this water when it comes in?
Hi, thanks for letting me come up again. Actually, I have a question that sort of surrounds that, what should we do, what should we be allowed to do right at the waterfront, sort of this idea of what happens and what kind of construction takes place. When we look at even, let's say, the Lightstone development, which is one of the main topics of today, people talking about the ways in which it's affecting the community, I mean, to bring out a like very recent EPA thing that happened, the EPA has sort of settled with Lightstone to the tune of some $30 million, if not more, in cleanup costs that were not part of their original scope, let's say, of cleaning up when they were testing the site, looking at it, or retesting it after the Toll Brothers were there. Anyway, the point is that the site is more contaminated than apparently anyone thought, and the actual zoning of it to some community members, because there's community dissent, is come across as questionable. Now that we know that the site is even more contaminated than it was thought to be when the zoning change was allowed by city planning. And so we sort of, people in the community look at that and say, if that's the kind of decision making which led to this kind of project, it starts with the city. And then the city is also one of the PRPs, one of the main people that's paying for the cleanup. And so clearly they're heavily involved, and they also are heavily involved with things like the retention banks. Basically, the city is one and part of this cleanup. But they allowed this residential development to happen, which is still questionable, I think, even as it's being constructed. Not the amenities, not the public side of things, which are all wonderful, but that it happened at all is kind of an issue in the community that I think, especially in terms of design, there are ways to fix a lot of the issues that I think people had with that kind of development happening. And my question is at the end of the day, if the city's calling the shots and the development money pushes the directions those shots go, how much can we as a community really actually determine what happens here? Because I can say that you have this picture here of the Kentile floor sign, but we all know that it's not there anymore. And that's a big part of the character of the neighborhood. So were the Burns Brothers coal pockets, which are right there, also gone. Now, these are landmarks, industrial landmarks of the community, which, you know, in the case of the Burns Brothers coal, they're gone. Kentile floor supposedly is coming back, may never come back. What's going to happen, as we say, to our landscape if we actually don't really have any control over it, to the point that even the pollution that we're building on top of is an unknown to us, or in danger of polluting the canal? How do we deal with these very real issues that are happening right now? And I know that's not really what this forum is about, but like you were trying to determine the future here through design. So what can you say to that, and put design in there somewhere?
Yeah, okay, I think there were about 15 questions in there. I mean, I think that the loss of both of those landmarks is a call to arms in a way for the community to actually get together and say, yeah, this happened, there are reasons why it happened, how can we have a conversation before it happens again? Instead of saying, we don't want any development whatsoever, we say, there's some development happening, how can it happen in the best way possible? How can we all talk about it and come up with what our values are, what the values that we share are? One question.
Well, I guess a longer but short answer is you need a plan. You need a plan. That's perhaps a bit more prescriptive than a strategy. You need a plan that is a collaborative effort that informs very clearly what the city's agenda is, because the city is ultimately the agency that moves forward with the development of the plan, and the memorializing, if you will, of the plan into some more substantial rules that become essentially law, the law, zoning. And so you need a plan.
I'd like to add also, I'm Andy Simons, I'm the chairman of the Conservancy, and have been with the Conservancy since its founding. And I actually think I think that was a great question, or small paragraph, soliloquy. But I think specifically to the Lightstone project and the fact that they discovered additional contaminants than they suspected there, and that our government agency, specifically the EPA, could come to a consent agreement with the developer to spend, and at the moment it's actually $22 million that they've agreed to. Yeah, of course, but at the moment the consent agreement is $22 million. It means that it's working. So here, and the Whole Foods site is another example of a developer comes in, whether maybe someone knew that there were a level of contaminants there or not, but the general consensus where there wasn't a knowledge of the contaminants at that level, and they were then forced, a private entity was forced to clean it up. That's good, because in the world we exist in today, unless the rest of us want to start having taxes rise up, which we don't, and we all argue about that every day, it's not, and why should the public be the one who has to foot that bill? Why should my tax dollars have to pay for that cleanup? If I can get a private entity to clean it up, it's a different model, and the Conservancy's actually had multiple lectures and talks on that model of who cleans up. And in that particular case, and when you have a site like the Gowanus Canal, where about 86% of the frontage in the area is privately owned and is most likely contaminated, it's going to really be that partnership of private and public, and hopefully the majority of that falls on the public side. I mean, the private side, sorry. And I think, and the EPA representative who's here should also, can correct me if I'm wrong, but the main arm behind Superfund is that it's not public funds. It's not supposed to be public funds that pays for it, but the PRPs, in this case, unfortunately, 2, if not 3 of the major PRPs are public, also being the city, state, and federal government, should be the ones who are required for the cleanup. Why is that unfortunate? Well, it comes back to, it's the taxpayers, again, who are paying for cleanup of, you know, in the case of the city sewer system, it is us who polluted it, so we should be cleaning it up. But in any case, I'm going away from our initial question. But, you know, I think as this shines the light on the complexity of the Gowanus Canal, and that with every little move forward, we're going to discover more issues, and we will need to constantly adapt to those.
So I think we take 2 more questions, and then we have to break for lunch in order to stay on time. So we're queued up and ready to go. Thank you.
Back on the theme of the panel, I'm just wondering whether it's guidelines or a master plan, if each of you might describe 1 or 2 elements that you think will be crucial to include in the park, in the park, and also a second part, if you can answer, would there be an overall theme that you would want to have, and if your elements related to that, that would be great as well.
Since I'm holding the microphone, public access into the canal, which I think is going to be the topic of the next question, and performance, ability to deal with storm surge, and ability to provide ecosystem services.
I would say, I would agree with the suggestion that, it's not a suggestion, that the reality that the Gowanus community is going to change dramatically, whether there's a plan or whether there's not a plan. I think there needs to be a plan, and I think that plan needs to be, in some places, very prescriptive. I think that plan needs to achieve a measure of balance between the interests of folks who may not have the community's interests at heart and the community's interest. And that has to somehow be developed as it's somehow proceeding collaboratively with a significant amount of input from this community, this broad community.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, maybe the idea of a comprehensive master plan is what's seeming too daunting, the idea of trying to tackle every facet of every parcel and what it might be. And perhaps, you know, another approach could be to think about surfacing those top 3 to 5 values, you know, public access, climate resiliency, green infrastructure, and really developing sort of, you know, looking at each one and thinking of, you know, 3 to 5 interventions that could be possible in each of those categories. Some of them will happen depending on where the development pressures lead you, and some of them won't happen. But if you have a plan, you can refer to them as those, you know, redevelopment issues come up, because sometimes they come up really quickly, and it's really helpful to have a document you can pull off and say, look, this is something that we thought of as a community. We went through a participatory process to develop this. This reflects not just my opinion, but, you know, however many people gave their input into the plan, and that's where I think the plan can be a really powerful document.
So I agree with most of what I'm hearing here. I think that going back to this importance of quantifying things, I think you want to create a sort of some benchmarks for how much water do you want to collect through green infrastructure in your watershed? What's a meaningful number to keep the canal clean and to reduce CSOs? It can be the DEP's number, maybe there's another number, in talking to some scientists or hydrologists that makes sense. And so you start with that. Then, if you're interested in, carbon sequestration, is there a number you want to think about in terms of taking carbon out of the air? And, what Tree Kit is talking about, and then, so think about all the different benchmarks you want, and then think about how you apply it. And I think what you're going to have to do is create a plan to do that. So you say, okay, like the ABC carpet, you have a site that's got a huge parking lot and a huge roof. You count that site into the equation. And then what happens is what you can do once you have a plan is you have to tie these projects to funding streams. Someone's got to pay for that. So if you've got your ABC carpet site, you could begin to approach the DEP private owners grant. If you've got the streets, you're already in a priority area. DEP, as my understanding, is open to working with the Gowanus on integrating green infrastructure on the streets. So you've got that piece of it. So I think it's about, you need the plan to, even if you had a set of guidelines or strategies, a team within the Gowanus Conservancy or an outside group needs to know how it would look, to even know that it's actually meaningful and know that it would actually work. Which is actually, for me, the plan and the Greenway was really to even know if it was meaningful or how it would actually work. So that's my answer to that question.
My name is Owen Foote, Gowanus Dredgers Canoe Club. I apologize for being late and if this question has already been asked. Just for the record, we've had less than 10 people introduced into the canal. We have been responsible for 15,000 people in the last 15 years introduced on the Gowanus waterway as well as the rest of New York Harbor. That leads me to my question. Currently, New York City waterfront regulations do not require ways to get out of the canal should somebody actually fall in. I'm wondering if there's any examples. So far, all I've found is England, and I've been less successful convincing our Department of Buildings to adopt such legislation. If there's any legislation, lots of towns in a lot of different municipalities in our country that have actually required off-water access when shoreline developments such as the Whole Foods site, which is 700 feet of a barrier to get off of the water. Is there any way, any other municipalities, anything else we can search for that we can use as arguments to allow us to get off the water? Thank you.
I just want to ask a clarifying question just to make sure I understand. So you're wondering if you're paddling and you're on a boat and there's some kind of incident and you need to get someone to safety quickly, to have sort of designated spots where you can get people out of the water into emergency vehicles or whatever?
Just to land at all in New York Harbor.
Oh,
Currently, waterfront zoning regulations, waterfront building regulations do not require any developer to allow access off of the water. And particularly on a Gowanus contaminated waterway, this is even more important than it is on other waterways that are far more dangerous, like the East River fast-moving currents or other portions of New York Harbor. We understand the designers in the room, your challenges. Hey, I do what the developer says. The developer doesn't want to take that on. So I'm looking to legislation. I'm hoping Baltimore, somebody else has it somewhere else in this country, that when you build on a shoreline, you actually build with a, I guess, a genuflection to somebody who's actually on the water so that they can enjoy the shoreline just as much as those looking at them from land.
Yeah, I think Owen, I had presented the work that we were doing and the work that we're doing with the dredgers at 2nd Street, and I neglected to give you folks more credit than I should have, because I think that that our design was shaped by the requirements of access. Again, I don't know, because I sat out that dance with the dredgers in Lightstone. I don't know the liability issues, but clearly, if there are access points, what comes with that is, well, the legal issues and the liability. That said, there are lots of opportunities at the street ends to integrate some kind of incremental access into the canal. Further, what we have done as well is we've lowered the bulkhead elevation on a portion of the canal, both as a means of, again, historic interpretation, this narrative thread that I explained, but also, again, it's another way of getting somebody out of the canal onto some kind of shore point. I don't know whether we'll be able to do that on the other side at the Bat Cave site, but I think at this point, the only thing I can say is that we'll try.
Well, please join me in thanking the panel for all their wonderful insights today.